Episode 4, The Struggle for Power, November 1918, January 1990. Any and all information covered in this audiobook originated from the 5th chapter of the First Germany booklet. Following the abdication of the Kaiser, a struggle for power ensued in which different political groups vied for control to shape the future political, economic, and social structure of Germany. Friedrich Ebert, leader of the moderate socialist SPD, did not believe in violent revolution. He wanted to build a democratic parliamentary system of government, and his first priority was to organize elections for a constituent assembly which would draw up a new constitution. In Berlin and other major cities, there was ongoing disorder as unemployed ex-soldiers and discontented workers became embroiled in demonstrations, strikes, and violent clashes with the police and army. Workers' and soldiers' councils regarded themselves as rival sources of power and demanded radical and immediate change, including the confiscation of land from the aristocracy, the nationalization of important industries, and democratic control over the army, the civil service, and the judicial system. Left-wing political groups, such as the USPD and the Spartakists, supported these demands. The role of the army was crucial in the struggle for power. The army's new leader, General Groener, valued order and discipline and was determined to defeat any attempt at a communist revolution. To this end, he agreed a pact with Ebert to support the government as long as the Chancellor promised to resist radical change to the army. In December 1918, the army intervened to stop a Spartakist demonstration in Berlin and then crushed a sailors' anti-government revolt. In January 19, the Spartakists attempted an armed uprising against the government in Berlin. Led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the insurgents occupied public buildings and newspaper offices. With limited support, the rising was defeated by the army and the Free Corps, paramilitary organizations made up of former soldiers, in brutal street fighting. Both Liebknecht and Luxemburg were killed after being captured. The defeat of the Spartakists paved the way for elections to the Constituent Assembly later in January. The Constituent Assembly chose Ebert as president of the new German Republic, and a coalition government was formed by the SPD, Centre and German Democratic parties. The way was clear for the Assembly to draw up a new constitution. The assessment of how powerful different forces within Germany were in 1918 is a crucial factor in determining the overall judgment of Ebert's handling of the situation. Both views above put a lot of emphasis on the prospect of a proletariat revolution. However, the analysis by Kolb and Rürup, 1988, of the Workers' Council's movement found that very few fell under the control of the extreme revolutionary left. Some historians therefore argue that not only was the threat from the revolutionary communists grossly exaggerated, but the wide basis of support for the SPD and USPD actually suggested that Ebert's government did not have to cooperate with the leading elements of the old regime to the extent that it did. If the Social Democrats had shown a greater degree of political will, they could have altered more and would not have had to preserve so much. Generally, parties on the moderate left, like the SPD, emphasized social justice, even if that means making people do things for the common good, collective ownership of important businesses, otherwise called nationalization, higher taxes on the rich to pay for more services for the poor, protecting workers' rights. Government should be controlled by the working classes. They opposed violent revolution and wanted peaceful change through democratic processes. Generally, parties of the centre, like the Zentrum, the left liberals DDP, sometimes the right liberals DVP, emphasized individual human rights, personal freedom, even if that means problems for other people. Private ownership of important businesses. Private property is really important to centrists. Low rates of taxes wherever possible. Centrists believe that individuals know best how to spend their money. Compromises on workers' rights. The government should be done by well-educated people. Their main theory is personal freedom, religious freedom, freedom to start businesses, freedom of speech. Generally, parties of the moderate right or conservative parties, like the Nationalist Liberals, sometimes DVP, DNVP, emphasized tradition because they believed that if you get rid of systems and ways of life that everyone understands, chaos ensues and everyone's a loser. National pride, gradual change, private property. The government should be run by people who really understand it, who have been brought up in the governing. The working classes should be cared for and protected to a moderate degree, but the fundamental relationships between different groups, aristocracy and junkers, middle classes and working classes should be preserved. All of the moderate parties generally supported human rights, free speech and some sort of democracy, though they argued about what sort. However, parties on the extreme right and extreme left generally argued that the Great War, as they called the First World War, and its outcomes showed that everything about the traditional views of the moderate parties was wrong. After all, it was these broad-based, moderate parties which had caused the Great War and all the mass slaughter, starvation, misery and disease, the defeats, as well as the breakup of social and political order. The extreme left, like the KPD, communists, Spartakists, argued that the control of political power in Germany by the middle classes, Catholics, military and aristocracy had to be smashed. The working classes should take control. For the extreme left, society was of the working classes. This would have to happen by violence and with the suspension of the existing laws and human rights, because otherwise the middle classes, military and aristocracy would keep control. Indeed, they argued that the middle classes, military and aristocracy had already murdered millions of Germans by starting a pointless war of conquest. The extreme right tended to argue that evil elements in the population, Jews, socialists, communists, liberals, homosexuals and feminists, were destroying society with pathetic, wishy-washy, impractical, self-serving ideas. For the extreme right, society wasn't the nation. They advocated an authoritarian state, suspending civil rights to tackle the antisocial elements. As they saw them, they generally wanted to build up the military, but not with the traditional aristocratic leadership. They often supported some welfare rights for the working classes, like benefits for women to have more children, who could be soldiers and workers in the service of the nation. But these benefits would be granted to support the nation and national power, not because of trade union or worker action. They would not be tolerated at all. The situation in late October and early November was characterized by disorder and uncertainty. The primary goals of the new government, led by Friedrich Ebert, were immediately end the war and negotiate a peace, prevent a communist revolution, end mutinies and restore order in terms of crime and political violence, find food, prepare for elections to select representatives for a constituent assemblies. This would be a group of elected representatives, a bit like MPs, but in power on a very short-term basis, with the purpose of drawing up a constitution. On these objectives, there was a broad consensus across the Zentrum. Most of the SPD, the left liberals, Democrats, nationalists and aristocracy. But the SPD had further goals around increased welfare provision, workers' rights, higher taxes, more schooling, healthcare and, perhaps above all, social counselling housing. These issues broke up any consensus because they were expensive and the country didn't have any money, and they challenged the vested interests of the middle classes, junkers and aristocracy. Contemporaries were very aware of the revolution and its shocking consequences, which had taken place in Russia in October 1917, just 1 year earlier. SPD leader and Chancellor Prime Minister, the workers' councils were 29 highly influenced, especially in Bremen and Munich, and the Spartacist League, later KB, believed that the time was ripe for the realization of the proletariat's workers' goals. Ebert realized that to avoid further revolution, the new coalition government needed the backing of the army. The officer class of the army was predominantly of aristocratic stock, meaning that they had been extremely loyal to the Kaiser, opposed democracy, and had no wish to see Germany become a republic. However, they also feared that the country was on the brink of a Bolshevik revolution, along the lines of the Russian Revolution in 1917, which they believed could lead to a civil war and Allied occupation. Assessing the apparent Bolshevik revolution as a greater threat than the democracy, the commander of the armed forces, General Groener, contacted Ebert on 10th November 1918. Groener pledged the army's support to the government in return for assurances that Ebert would resist calls of the soldiers' councils to democratize the army and defend Germany against a communist revolution. Ebert assured Groener that the government was determined to avoid further revolutions and would fully support the army in its suppression of any further revolution attempts. The Spartakists' revolution. Whilst Ebert and the government were preparing for elections to a constituent assembly to be held in January 1919, the army, with increasing reliance on the Free Corps, continued to assert its influence by suppressing any revolutionary outbreaks. In late 1918, the USPD members of Ebert's government resigned, citing the shooting of some Spartakists as the reason. However, the split had really emerged over the USPD's desire to introduce fundamental social and economic changes that the SPD did not want to adopt. The SPD government became increasingly isolated. It moved further to the political right and grew dependent on the army and the civil service to maintain law, order, and effective government. In January 1919, the Spartakists launched an armed uprising in Berlin with the aim of replacing the provincial government with a Soviet republic. By January 5th, the Spartakists occupied public buildings, called for a general strike, and formed a revolutionary committee. They also denounced the provisional government and the upcoming elections. However, they had little chance of success, and after 3 days of savage street fighting, the coup was easily defeated. Over 100 people lost their lives in the uprising, and the leaders of the revolution, most notably Liebknecht and Luxemburg, were brutally murdered whilst in police custody. The failed coup showed that the Spartakists, while strong on policies, had very little support and were detached from political realities. They had no real organization or strategy, and their revolutionaries were mainly just workers armed with rifles. By contrast, the government not only had the backing of the trained army troops, but also 5,000 irregular military-style groups of soldiers leaving the army, the Free Corps, the first free elections. There were elections to a National Assembly in January 1919 to meet in the small town of Weimar to draw up a constitution. An important feature of these elections was that radical and revolutionary parties of both right and left did not do well. This may suggest that the revolutionary potential of OCDC 1918 was not real. It was a spectacular set of events, but underpinned by more mainstream concerns. The radical and independent SPD acquired 7.6% of votes, which amounted to 22 seats. The Zentrum acquired 19.7% of votes, which amounted to 91 seats. The DDP, German Democratic Party, acquired 18.5% of votes, which amounted to 75 seats. The DVP, German People's Party, acquired 4.4% of votes, which amounted to 19 seats. This result closely mirrored electoral divisions in Reichstag elections before the war. It meant that the new constitution would be drawn up by the majority SPD, Zentrum, and DDP. It would be moderate and relatively conservative. The National Assembly began drafting the Constitution on 6 February 1919, and on 11 February, the National Assembly elected Friedrich Ebert to be President of the Reich, not the Public. The Free Corps was largely composed of officers and men returning from the war as the military machine was wound down. Of particular importance, in Berlin, they were led by Gustav Noske. He was a leading member of the SPD, now allying with army officers to put down a workers' revolt. The revolt created a troubled atmosphere for the next few months, and the continuation of strikes and general disorder in Berlin meant that the Assembly's first meeting was moved to the town of Weimar in February 1919. In April, more serious disturbances in Bavaria led to a short-lived Soviet-type republic being established there. However, this was soon crushed by the increasingly violent actions of the Freikorps. The infant republic had survived the traumas of its birth, but at what cost? Ensure that soldiers and their families had some kind of future as they left the army and navy. Prevent invasion by foreign powers. The moderate and mainstream SPD acquired 37.9% of votes, which amounted to 165 seats. The conservative DNVP, German National People's Party, acquired 10.3% of votes, which amounted to 44 seats.